Yeah, some of you may remember, I know, Steve, you probably remember, back in 2000, the Say No to Hate Coalition came up with a really creative idea to deal with a very troubling situation that really could have gotten out of hand. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, came to town and demonstrated. Actually, the date was September 30th, 2000. They did the demonstration downtown at City Plaza. So there was a lot of consternation in the community about how to deal with that really negative, toxic message that was being delivered by the KKK. So the Say No to Hate Coalition came up with a really creative idea. And the idea was to tell people to respect the right of the KKK to demonstrate and promote its message, however offensive that message might be. But to counter that message the next day by doing a silent sweep on City Hall Plaza. So it literally was a silent sweep. People brought mops and brooms and trash bags and literally cleaned the plaza from the stench of the hatred that was left by the KKK. Now that's a very assertive and authentic way, albeit symbolically, to communicate a very powerful message. And it really emboldened those people who were there. It allowed them to express themselves in a way that they knew was effective. And it was also a message that was appealing to the media, right? A positive message that appealed to the media, that promoted tolerance, acceptance, understanding, and so forth. So to me, that's a great example of authenticity and communication.
Terrific. I had meant to say this earlier. I'm not going to do this all on a solo flight for 50 minutes up here. I hope that you're all thinking of smart questions that you can ask our panel as we go along, and there'll be time for that. But let's meet our next speaker, Professor Greenbaum. Did I get you?
Yes, you have it correct.
Your research in this area, especially the communications between, I think,
Right.
employers and employees, is fascinating. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what your research has found.
Okay. Yes, I'm Rebecca Greenbaum. I'm an assistant professor at the Spear School of Business, Oklahoma State University. I graduated from the University of Florida, and then I did go into industry, and I worked in the insurance industry for a couple of years. And then I decided I wanted to go back and receive my PhD. At the time, my husband and I already owned a house in Florida, in the Orlando area, so we decided that it made sense for me to apply to the University of Central Florida, and that's ultimately where I ended up getting my master's and my PhD. But one of the interesting things was that a lot of my research questions actually centered on the area of ethics and fairness in the organization. And the University of Central Florida had one of the best programs at the time there in the management department of their College of Business. I worked, fortunately, with some of the brightest minds when it comes to ethics and justice, and my dissertation ended up being in that area. And since then, the last 5 years that I've been out and here at Oklahoma State, I've published a lot of research articles related to ethics and fairness in the workplace. Now, when it comes to authentic communication in the area of organizational justice, or what we would often call fairness, there is an element that has to do specifically with communication. We call it a fancy name, informational justice, but it really just boils down to the fact that if you provide people with honest communication and candid communication up front, it's going to lead to much more favorable outcomes for your organization as opposed to not doing those things. I've actually presented to a series of different organizations or different groups actually in the Oklahoma area about this topic. And one thing that I find is a lot of people in practice, they just feel like they don't have the time to provide those two things that I would say are key elements of authentic communication. But unfortunately, what that does is it ends up leaving employees not very motivated, unhappy, less job satisfaction, more likely to turn over. So to avoid some of those negative outcomes, at least in the workplace, it's really important to consider things like informational justice, or what we're calling here today authentic communication.
Help me think about that a little bit more specifically. When you're having a difficult conversation with an employee, what are mistakes that are commonly made, and what are methods of avoiding them?
So an easy example, I suppose, is that most of you, if you're in a leadership role, you probably have to provide performance evaluations at some point across the year. And so when you sit down and you talk to the employee about their performance, the woman who was up here just before Lynn, or just after Lynn, she made the point, actually, it was perfectly clear. Oftentimes we just don't want to have those tough conversations. There's a lot of reasons why, and I could actually go through all the psychological reasons why, but I'm not going to at the moment. But we don't like to. It makes us feel uncomfortable for whatever reason. And so when you are in that position of providing that performance evaluation, oftentimes managers, statistically, 5 out of 7 managers are more likely to lie about an employee's performance than be honest about the areas where they're failing, where they're not doing very well. So that's a problem. If they do deliver feedback, oftentimes those employees will go back to the job and they'll still be demotivated even though they received effective feedback. And part of the problem is that sometimes managers will focus on the person as opposed to behaviors. So a good example would be, let's say you were sitting down with an employee, rather than saying you lack conscientiousness, which would be offensive to that person perhaps and automatically put them on the defense, what you could do is say, look, you're our administrative person, we really need you to do a thorough job, and look at these 7 reports that I have, look at all the mistakes that you made. That's behavioral, and they're much more likely to accept that type of feedback if you focus on those behaviors and don't make it personal.
I'm really looking forward to ask you some more questions on this topic. Jeremy Burton, you, my old friend, you've literally been through the fiery furnace of, well, not literally, you figuratively have been through the fiery
Sure.
furnace of crisis communications to the public. Tell us about yourself and some of your experiences.
Sure. My name is Jeremy Burton. I am accredited in public relations. I was glad Lucinda brought that up. I think that that's a great mark in our industry. Excited to be here with you today. Like any good PR person, I had to bring a team with me, so Carissa from my office is here, but I also brought 15 other PR students from ORU are here with us today. So if you hear the big loud roars, you guys, everyone from ORU, wave your hands. All the ORU students, they're all over the room. So just make for sure you guys cheer loud. And apparently after this, I understand Justin Timberlake may be here on the property, so I guess we're going to go look for JT after this. Is that right? Okay, thank you. Just excited to be here. It has been interesting to learn crisis communications. I actually started cutting my teeth in crisis comm as a member of the marketing PR department at St. Francis Hospital Health System. One of the things that is interesting working there is we actually were a patient advocate. So anytime that a high-profile case came up, we actually would go into media mode. Anything from a dog bite. Someone got bit by a dog. I was on point whenever there was an arcene gas leak at the Port of Catoosa. And we took media calls. We had like 50 people bust into the hospital, and you just go into the mode of making for sure that the patients are taken care of at that point. I do want to point out one thing, just as I think about my journey. And yeah, we have had some challenges at Oral Roberts University, or as a friend of mine liked to call it, my year of personal growth. We had interesting times, but I'm looking around the room at who poured into my life that helped me get through those situations. I got Lauren Brookie back there as a mentor of mine from TCC, Missy Cruz, Tim Colwell is here, Steve Turnbow is a longtime mentor, and actually a brother in arms, David Wagner, who's at Schnocky Turnbow. And I think of the contribution, I just want you all to hear this, the contribution that you all have made into my life. And so I don't just sit here on my own, I sit here on your expertise that you guys have put into me over all these years, and I'm thankful for that.
So, Jeremy, I was, for 13 years, I was the city editor of the Tulsa World, and when you're the city editor, you get to see a lot of people in their worst moments, in crisis situations. Give us some tips. I mean, you've been there. What are 5 things you need to remember when the balloon goes up?
Yeah, I'll tell you 3 things, and actually, this is great that they did this. There's a little handout. I'd like to get into a little more, but anytime that you're in a crisis situation, I think there are 3 things that you've got to do. You've got to get information out. It's got to be quick, not fast. You can't be hasty. It's got to be quick. It's got to be accurate, and it has to be thoughtful. You have to make for sure that you do it in a way that honors the community in which you live, the community in which you work. your community. I don't know. Actually, I'd like to go ahead. Can I talk about? We did a little phone discussion. I do want to give you all kind of a case study from our campus. We had an unfortunate, just tragic situation. This was about a year and a half ago. We had a young lady who was murdered off campus. She was a student on our campus. Horrible, just a horrible situation for our community. And so as that started to unravel, over all these years, I've picked up this. I'm very aware of our internal audiences, and as you have these types of situations come in front of you, it is really important that you communicate to the right people in the right way. And so what we did is we said, okay, this is the situation. We understand. We got all the information. I understood exactly what was going on, and we said, we're going to communicate in this order. Have the parents been notified? Great, we got the parents on board. We're going to go talk to the roommate. Has the roommate been? And all along the way, we were checking the box to make for sure that we did this right. After the roommate was taken care of, we made for sure we got all the girls on the floor together to talk to them. Then we made for sure all the students knew what was going on and all of our campus community. Along the way there, we did talk to our trustees because the trustees are the ones entrusted, that the organization's entrusted to. Then at that point, then we released it to the media. We released it on social media to tell everyone what was going on. But we've learned that if you jump the gun and you go just to the media first, you dishonor everyone that's in your internal community and you end up creating distrust. So we are very, very intentional in how we do that. That's thoughtful communication. That reflects well on your organization. And we continue as these situations come up, you have to think about how your communication is going to impact your entire audience. Don't just look at the media. And there's times, that may be a 30-minute time span that all that happens, but we were being thoughtful in the way that we did it.
It seemed to me one of the things I admired in the more than one occasion when I saw you dealing with these circumstances was that, the first time that you and David were in a crisis wasn't the first time that I had met you. That you had obviously thought about this in advance, and wanted to make sure that the groundwork was there. Is that do you think that's a key part of the process of, if you're in a potentially risky situation to have made those relationships ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have pre-established relationships in crisis. That's from a management level, not just from a communication. What he's talking about specifically, I already had a relationship with a lot of people at the paper, a lot of people in the media, and as these things come up, you hope that they have trust in you that whenever I call you and I tell you something that is the truth, and that I'm not lying, I'm not trying to spin it, I'm trying to tell you exactly what it is, exactly where I sit. And I do think that helped us, especially in what we went through in 2007 and then beyond in the rest of these situations. Another kind of unusual thing, if you do it right in crisis and in the way that you talk, you should walk away from a crisis with stronger relationships and more relationships than what you had before. I actually did not know Ziva Brandstetter real well before that, but I got to know Ziva Brandstetter pretty well. If you guys know her, she's the investigative journalist, and I consider her a friend. She's a great journalist. There's always, between PR and media, there's always a little bit of an adversarial relationship, but it still is congenial, and there still are people that, these people at the Tulsa World, people at News on 6, people at all these publications, we're friends, we know each other. And we work, we keep everything very professional. I think you have to build trust ahead of time.
Let's go to you. Anyone have any questions they want to bring up at this point? I'm ready to continue, but I want to involve you in the process. So anyone out there?
Right. Well, and that's one of those things.
Yeah, to repeat the question, the reference was to the to fast-breaking story in Florida, a retirement community where someone was in a life crisis. In a health crisis, and the 911 operator was instructing them to do CPR, and the response was, that's not our policy. And the question was, how do you, in such a fast-breaking national story in that case, how do you take the time to communicate to your stakeholders?
Two things that I would say. The first one is if you all or who are in leadership at organizations, your PR person should not be a person locked down in a closet that's writing press releases to make you all look good. It should be someone that is a part of your leadership team that actually it's a management function, right? You should have someone at your table that's a communicator. Because what I would have asked this other company is that a good policy? Is that really the best? Is that the best policy? Because a lot of these crises that you see are crises that we put on ourselves because we're making poor management decisions, or we're making bad, or we didn't realize the consequences of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I'm trying to think from your perspective, I think that anytime that you see a national crisis like this, it's an opportunity for you to speak to your audience about what you would do. So I think that's a great opportunity for you to send out to your, whether it's by phone. What I don't know is I don't know how you talk to your people. Social media, I'm assuming, is not a big vehicle. So how do you do it? Is it a phone tree? Is it you do an announcement over lunch? But I would actually use that as an opportunity to say, hey, this situation happened. We want you to know that we will always try and resuscitate you. If you have something going on, we will always call 911 because you are more important to us than the bottom line. You are more important to us than policy. And that's a great opportunity to reinforce your own culture, to reinforce your commitment to your customer. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
Versus sitting there with, has a, not wanting to resuscitate, you don't know that. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you look at that.
No, that's it. And Liberty University is a sister university on the East Coast. They had an issue where they had a security guard actually shoot a student. They had a student altercation. And we actually are sitting internally and we are digesting this situation to say, what does this mean for us? What is this? I mean, that Virginia Tech was the same thing. Whenever that happened, we all said, how are we communicating to students? Anytime that you see those points like that in your own industry, we should all sit back and say, how can we do it better based on this information?
Dr. Greenbaum, you have anything that you would like to add to that thought?
Well, I do have a couple of things that I could add. So there are other crises that you might experience in your organization could have to do with ethical crises where someone did something bad. And oftentimes organizations don't respond in a very effective way because they go into denial mode first. But if you're more likely to admit fault up front and to take corrective action, and if you do have a good action plan in place, the recovery, it's actually exactly what you just said, Jeremy. The recovery, you can actually come out of the situation, even if it's an ethical failure, with better accolades or just looking better for the organization because you handled the crisis, the ethical crisis, so well. There's actually a term within the marketing literature that's called the service recovery paradox. So if you have a service failure, but you come back and you're over the top and you do an excellent job in terms of servicing the customer who lost in some way, that customer and subsequent customers might look even more favorably onto you. Well, the same is true when it comes to handling ethical crises that might come up because of some failings of top managers or other people. So I think that echoes your point.
Terrific. Hannibal, as the lawyer on the panel, are there liability concerns in conceding mistakes publicly in these sort of circumstances?
The short answer is yes. Yes, there are concerns. But I want to go sort of slightly back in a different direction that we've touched on a little bit, and that is the whole notion of building this reservoir of trust. Because it seems to me that no matter how authentic your communication is in any given circumstance, unless you've established a reservoir of trust upon which to draw, your communication is likely to be questioned. Mm-hmm. So, and that also relates to my point earlier about cultural competency. And one of the things that this community, a dynamic that exists in this community that traces, in my mind, as far back as the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, is this, what I call a gulf of distrust along racial lines. And so until that gulf is narrowed, it's much more difficult for us to communicate across cultures, across racial lines, even though we intend our communication to be authentic. Does that make sense? You've got to have a foundation of trust is sort of my bottom line. I absolutely agree with you.
So what are the strategies for building that foundation?
It begins by establishing what I call intimate interpersonal relationships. So it's not I have a black friend. It's that you regularly engage with people in intimate ways, and those people are different from you in terms of race, ethnicity, culture. So it's not saying I have a black friend, it's actually having one. You know what I mean? It sounds like a subtle thing, but the reality is most of us have associations with, for the most part, people who are a lot like us in terms of race, ethnicity, and so forth. And so to build intimate associations across lines of difference is to establish the ultimate foundation for trust.
And that applies to institutions as well as
Absolutely.
individuals.
I think so.
Again, it sounds like something that you don't start dealing with while the building's on fire.
Right.
You deal with that
Right.
well in advance, right?
Right. I'm a big fan of what you might call strategic thinking, and that is sort of considering in advance what your needs might be, building the foundation, and then it's much easier to deal with crises if and when they arise. What do you think?
I agree. I definitely agree.
Right.
Other questions?
I don't know. I mean, I probably a C, some sort of average marking. Yeah.
So even at Oklahoma State University in the Spear School of Business, for all majors, taking an ethics course is not a requirement. We just made it a requirement for management majors. So all the students that I'm teaching, I teach ethical leadership in organizations right now. All those management students are receiving some type of ethical guidance. Unfortunately, some of them still think that it's not needed. I think a lot of times people assume I come from a really good upbringing, I have good moral values, my parents raised me with religion,
Sure.
I don't need to hear any of this, but it's very different when you get out in the corporate world, and I'm sure most of you in this audience know, there's very specific different ethical dilemmas that you experience in a work environment that you're not going to experience in your regular lives. And so that's part of the reason we've decided we needed that ethics training for our students. And I still think that it's a little bit difficult for them to conceptualize it, but my hope is that 5 years down the road when they have encountered some of those challenges, they'll think back to some of the things that they've learned in the courses that they've taken at Oklahoma State. Now, in terms of more globally across the country, there's a huge push. It started to happen in the early 2000s when we saw Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, some of those catastrophes related to ethics. We saw business schools across the country start to offer more ethics training or ethics courses to take, I suppose you could say. There are some universities who have been doing things like this much sooner than the last 10 years, but then there's others who still really haven't caught on to it yet. In terms of organizational training, I think it actually has a lot to do with the culture of the organization. The corporation that I worked in before I became a professor, went and got my PhD and then became a professor, they provided the training, but it in no way was enforced. It was more what we call window dressing, and that had to do with the culture where it was much more bottom line focused, and because that bottom line was more important than anything else, the means to getting to the bottom line really wasn't upheld, meaning that ethical standards sometimes were forgotten when it came to the way you actually completed your jobs. And so I think that's a huge cultural thing related to the culture of the organization. I think more and more, actually they're required based on the new laws, Sarbanes-Oxley and things like that, especially the large corporations, are required to have training in place, but it's not always enforced. It's just window dressing for a lot of companies. I'd like to think that's changing, and there are some companies out there with awesome cultures who really put ethics at the forefront, but not all.
Hannibal, you had something.
I just wanted to say that I think that oftentimes, both in the university settings and in corporate settings, ethics is treated as a check-the-box item. In other words, it's not integrated in a meaningful way. So it's seen as something that is burdensome, that you have to get through, you can check it off, and then you move on. And that's part of the problem.
So let me build on that a little bit. Professor. What are some hallmarks of good ethics education and of bad? And you know, what I'm getting at here is, how do you teach people who are soon to be in the working world how to think about things ethically rather than carrying around a list of things that, well, I can't do that?
It's actually very difficult just because my students, some of them might go into engineering, some of them might go into finance, some might go into insurance. There's just a range of occupations, and actually a lot of the ethical dilemmas they're going to experience, they're going to be occupation specific. So a lot of the tools that I provide them in my class have to do with how do you analyze some of those situations, or what do you do when you do encounter that dilemma where your gut reaction is this is wrong, but your boss is telling you he or she is going to fire you if you don't comply with the request. So that's some of the ways that I approach it. I do have a lot of guest speakers come in to provide some of those examples, because I don't think the students always believe me that, yes, you're going to experience some of these ethical dilemmas. And so for instance, just 2 days ago, I had a CEO of North Star Energy in the Tulsa area, actually, and of Dover Energy. He came and spoke with my students, and he had 32 occurrences over the last 20 years that he experienced related to ethical dilemmas. So some of that crystallizes it for them, but I think it's really hard just to provide a laundry list of this is right or wrong, because it doesn't really work that way in the corporate environment. Unfortunately, our young students are the most at risk, just because when you're not exposed to an industry yet and you don't have any knowledge yet, those are the instances where you're more likely to fall into those ethical dilemmas. Even with what I do, a large part of what I do other than teaching is I complete research. And I had a student, which Tom Stone somewhere is here, so he knows what I'm talking about. But in the last few years, I had a PhD student who engaged in data piracy. Now, it could have potentially been argued what that means is the student took my data, started to publish with it, never told me, and that's wrong. It was more or less just stealing. But if a student came into the industry and wasn't aware of that as a researcher, that could be something where the student seriously just didn't know. Unfortunately, I think this student should have known better, but that's another story. When it comes to education in the corporate environment, though, some of the cultural standards need to be in place to go along with the training, so it isn't just checking off the box, and a lot of that comes with ethical leadership, where the leaders actually communicate, endorse, reward, punish, do all of these different things to uphold ethical standards.
Jeremy, the original question was, how do you grade the corporate and academic world in its ability to teach
Sure.
ethics?
Go ahead. I think certainly there is a void in teaching ethics on a higher education level, but it cannot be just all on the educators. It has to be on the company. If you have a culture that's a nasty culture that is okay with you cooking the books and you doing whatever you need to do to get to the bottom line, you're gonna find the most unethical people that you can. If you have a good, outstanding culture that squelches that, you're not going to. And this is, I have to say this, we talk about ethics all the time at the university, all the time. The students in the business department, students in the communications department, we talk about it a lot. We're known for that because for us, ethics is a natural extension of our faith. And that's something that I'm proud to be associated with. And I think there are more institutions that need to talk about ethics. That's Chet Kedjo from Quick Trip said he loves getting students, especially from ORU, because you can't really teach ethics easily. So when he gets them in, he already knows that they're going to be ethical. I think there are more CEOs like Chet that are looking for those types of employees that are going to be loyal, that are going to be above board, and the bottom line will work itself out.
Professor, I wonder if you would agree with this observation of mine as a reporter and editor concerning the ethical obligation to transparency and openness. And my observation is this: there's no one in this room that this applies to, but I've dealt with public information officers in the past that on Monday were thought of as officers of public information prevention, whose effort was to stop transparency. And on Tuesday, they turned into the model of transparency, and the difference was they had a new boss. That is that the expectations start at the top, and fairly quickly are communicated down the chain of command. Do you agree with that? Not just in terms of transparency, but in other ethical standards?
I do know, actually one of my earliest publications, and I'm not sure that this answers your question exactly, but one of my earliest publications on this topic shows that when it comes to ethical leadership, it cascades down the levels of the organization. So it's the middle managers are going to receive communication from the top managers who need to support ethical standards in order for those to be communicated down. And essentially that's going to turn into desirable outcomes in terms of employee behaviors, increased job performance, more citizenship behaviors, so doing beneficial things for the organization and things like that. So yes, I do think that with a change in leadership, you will see some of those changes where it just naturally flows down. So I think that's why when you do see some of these scandals, when we were talking about scandals related to ethics, the natural thing to do is to replace the top manager with somebody else in the hope that the ethical standards will improve. Over the years, though, some of the major scandals that have happened, even when they've replaced some of those CEOs, it's really, really hard to get that image back of being ethical. Through time, sometimes it does happen, but it's very difficult. Of course, it depends on how major the scandal was.
It's a great question. Let me repeat it. The question was, in addition to cultural competency, is there an importance to generational competency, an ability to communicate to all ages and in all fashions?
Absolutely. And when I use the word culture in cultural competency, I'm referring to sort of a broad term, the same way I use the word diversity. So it includes race and ethnicity, but it also includes age and other sorts of differences that might exist between and among us. It's important to be able to understand those differences and to develop a sense of empathy across various lines. And I'm glad you mentioned that. Again, not limiting the word the phrase cultural competency to issues of race and ethnicity, but thinking more broadly to all the diversities that exist between and among us.
Jeremy, how does communicating to your target audience different from communicating to their parents?
Yeah, I'm thinking through. You get into consistency in your communication, and the big thing that has changed in the last 10 years is technology for the way we communicate. And part of the generational issue that you're talking about goes to social media. Okay, great. So what do we do with this? It's all going faster. Before, if you needed to get something out to the company, you could hold. It was coming. They were doing a paper memo, and it could take days to get to whoever it was supposed to get to. They used to have these things called typewriters. I've never seen one, but I heard about them. But now it's like if something goes down, it's like that, and it's on social media. And so how do you deal with that internally? How does that bleed over into your external? So, your generations, and this is maybe a bit of a stereotype. This isn't always true. Your younger generation is probably going to talk better through Facebook or through Twitter. That actually is what we see in students. We learned, and this was a number of years ago, and I actually think the mark is moving a bit, but I had a student that I was trying to talk to about doing an interview with an Arkansas paper, called him, left a message, called him, and this was like 2 days. I couldn't get the student to write me back. So finally, I sent them a Facebook message, and within 10 minutes, I had a response. But I think what that tells us is we cannot just do it the way that we've always done it. Let's figure out a way to communicate to the heart of the target market. Maybe your company needs to set up a Facebook page or think about that as an internal way to talk. But you cannot do that and forget. If you have seasoned adults that aren't geared to talk like that, you got to make for sure that you're talking in the same way, but it's got to be the same thing, just through different channels. It's got to be the same message.
Professor Greenbaum, ethics are the same today as they were when Socrates was teaching them, right? So there's probably no difference in how they're communicated. Am I right?
There's just different challenges, and I do think social media and outlets like that do pose different challenges. There's actually an organization, it's based out of Washington, D.C., I believe, but it's called the Ethics Resource Center, and they do national surveys, I think once a year. And a lot of the top research scholars and management in our field actually are associated with the ERC too. And what they actually have found recently is that those who are social networkers, when I say social networkers, I'm not talking about, I know Hannibal and Jeremy, I'm talking about we're both on Facebook, all three of us are on Facebook, things like that, or Twitter. Those who are social networkers are more likely to observe and to be victims of unethical behavior in the workplace. The researchers have discovered this, but they don't know why yet. Why is this the case? Are these people, do they have a different mentality? Are they actually victims more, or do they just perceive the work world differently? I don't know. I actually don't know this area very well because it hasn't even been researched very much when it comes to things like social networking and different things like that. There's social issues too that sometimes are up for debate. So for instance, is it right that corporations use Facebook and different outlets like that to screen applicants because they do? Is that okay? I think it's California who recently came up with a law saying that that isn't allowed. You can't use social media to screen. I could be wrong on that, though. It's been a while since I checked that statistic. So some of the challenges are just different. So you might think of right and wrong as being the same as some of the major philosophers like Kant back in the 1700s, but I think that some of the ways that we're seeing it expressed is a bit different today. When it comes to managing across the generations, though, I think if you do have a culture of mutual respect, despite differences between the generations, especially since a lot of the baby boomer generation were living longer, everybody's working longer as well, and we actually need a lot of the baby boom generation to stay in the workforce. I think that, mutual respect and making sure that the younger generation, they do show that respect. And one thing I commonly hear among the older generations who have been working longer is this entitlement mentality among the younger students, and that's something that's not really researched much yet either, so I can't provide too much insights there. So.
Jeremy, I didn't prep you for this one, so we'll see how good you are at extemporaneous thought here. But I wonder if you could speak for a minute about the concept of managing up. We had a moment where we talked about how attitudes can cascade from the top down, but it seems to me that one of the ways of preparing for effective crisis communication is to make sure that your concepts are those of the ones of the CEOs. Mm-hmm. How do you prepare for that moment?
Well, and some of that goes to a relationship issue. You have to have a relationship with your CEO. Most PR people that I know, we always have a dotted line to the president's office. That's pretty typical. So I think talking about those issues on a daily basis and actually showing expertise as you go along is something that's important. But if there's no residual trust there, it gets back to the same issue. If the CEO doesn't trust what you have to say, it doesn't matter. And so just along the course, we always talk out PR issues and go, how are we going to deal with this? This is the situation that we had. This, I think, is the best way to do it. And if you've got a great CEO, if you've got a great boss, they'll talk it out with you and then go, I trust what you're going to do. I understand it. Let's go.
Professor Greenbaum, how do you have that difficult conversation with your boss? How do you tell him, no, we can't do it that way, and here's why?
That's an excellent question, and it is very difficult because bosses have so much power, and especially, I again talk about people new to an industry, they might have even more difficulty having those conversations, but I think it's really important to make that mark up front that you're not going to comply with unethical requests, for instance. And then, because let's say it's even something minor, there's this slippery slope there. If the boss asks you even to do something as simple as lying about the boss's whereabouts, one request like that might imply, if you are that subordinate, that you're willing to comply with other bigger requests like fudging numbers on year-end reports, something like that. I think that for your own sake, it's something that you need to do. I find it difficult, and I find this when I talk to my students about it, difficult too, especially the last few years where the economy has been more of a slump. It hasn't been as great. You really want to hang on to that job. You don't want to lose your job, but I still think for your own integrity, you need to stand up. And usually what I find is that people who do stand up for themselves, they're respected because of it. So making sure that respect is intact to begin with, I think, can carry you a long way.
So our time has flown. We have about 5 minutes. I think that's probably time for one more question. Anyone have something they're just dying to get out? Tim?
Jeremy, can you speak to the PRSA Code of Ethics, how that is a framework for PR professionals?
So how is the PRSA Code of Ethics a framework for PR professionals?
So
I'm sorry, for those of us who aren't PR professionals. I'm
Yeah.
probably the only one in the room.
Sure. So Public Relations
Define them.
Society of America, that's who it's a joint meeting with, is a professional organization that is really an advocate for public relations on the whole across the nation. So every professional organization should have a code of conduct for their members, and that's essentially what they've done is they've created a PR code of ethics that really encompasses the entire industry, it does deal with authentic communication. It deals with, too, if you have competing firms, we have a lot of firms around, they talk about how they deal with one another, how they, you're not going to go and disparage another firm. You're not going to go and plant some bad evidence. I know one of the things that's in the code that we've kind of talked about, and you kind of read this in, is, and this goes into a social media issue. There's an industry issue with pay for play, where you can pay to get on a blog. That, I believe, by our code of ethics is not cool. It's not okay. We shouldn't do that. And so we looked at those ethics, and those ethics, though, Tim, I would say, are only as good as the people who read them. And so we try our best. That's actually why we're doing this meeting today. We're doing this meeting today to keep ethics in front of our own professionals in the Tulsa area to say, hey, this is important. The great thing about Tulsa is I think most people are aware of those. Most of our PR professionals are aware of those and really adhere, and we really think about that as we go through our professional lives and how cordial we are to each other as communicators, but then making for sure that all the communications that we do are as ethical, not as ethical as we can get it, because that they're ethical.
Professor, do
That's
you have
important.
any thoughts to add on that? I mean, is codification essential to ethical behavior?
Can you repeat the question, the original
Is
question?
codifying the ethics
Right.
really an essential part of
Right.
ethical behavior?
I think if it's something formal in terms of codes of ethics, which are, as you mentioned, required especially for large organizations today, I think it's a requirement, so you have to do it, but it all still goes back to the culture of the organization, I think. And that really is, I think, the way that you sum it up, just because you can have codes in place, but if they're not enforced, again, it's just a mirage. It's just making you look like you're ethical when perhaps you're really not. And in some ways, actually, I have some research that speaks to this as well. In some ways, that could actually do you a disservice if you do promote ethical standards and have codes of conduct, and you don't enforce them, because what that does is it makes it salient to employees. They see that you have these codes, but you're doing just the opposite in terms of your behavior. So that would be a condition where maybe as an organization or maybe just the top leaders are seen as hypocrites. And sometimes our reactions to people where we have this hypocrisy reaction can actually be worse than if no ethical standards were in place to begin with.
In our last few minutes, I thought we'd go down the panel one more time and give each of you an opportunity to just express any sort of capstone thoughts you have on what we've talked about today. Deep breath.
Yeah, I want to raise the concept that's been sort of alluded to previously, and that is this notion that I call benign inauthenticity. And that is the idea that in places like Tulsa and some places in the South, we're very much concerned with politeness, which sometimes steers us in the wrong direction. We're not as assertive or as forthright as we ought to be when situations that need to be addressed come to the fore.
Professor?
No, I think that what Hannibal is saying is very interesting. One of my colleagues in the management department, she actually has research on mobility. And so if you're someone who can easily move and go to different locations, you're actually less likely to be forthright and honest with someone. Instead, you just keep that facade of being polite and I'm going to like you, but really I don't. So it just brought that to my mind. So that's very interesting that you brought that up. I think if I were to provide just any final conclusions with the main topic being authentic communication, I would just say make time for some of those conversations, even the ones that are more difficult, even those ones that make us feel uncomfortable and uneasy because we don't like the emotional experience of delivering bad news. It's really very important to manage those, especially for your organization's bottom line in terms of just having better performers. But also, employees respond better to that type of fair treatment. It is a form of fair treatment to deliver news that people deserve to know about.
Jeremy, the final word is going to be yours.
Two things. One is whenever you communicate, use all the tools at your discretion. We had guys see the eagle that we had in chapel the other day? Anyone ever see that? We got 90 million media impressions on an eagle hitting the window in our chapel. We didn't mean for it to happen, it just happened, but we use everything at our disposal to let everyone know that the eagle, just so you know, Lewis the eagle's fine, he's cool. But use every vehicle at your disposal the best that you can. Do that. Second thing is, if you're in a situation where your company makes a mistake, just own it. Just own it. Say that you're going to get better and actually get better and go on, because actions speak louder than words. We cannot spin these things. So as a leader in your organization, it's okay to say, you know what, we messed up. We're going to get better.
Terrific. Help me thank our panel today.